How do you react when you find yourself completely outnumbered as a Christian? Do you feel comfortable when you find yourself in the minority as a Christian? Do you even have any non-Christian friends? I don't mean Christians who don't go to church or who are not practicing their faith. I mean people who explicitly and without hesitation would say that they are not Christians. Do you even know someone like that? Do you hang out with them? Are you comfortable in their presence? How do you live and act in a culture that is completely foreign to your Christian ideals? That's what we're going to talk about today. Hi, I'm Ellis Orozco, and welcome to my channel, a place where we think out loud about the Bible and how its teachings have an impact on our daily lives. If that sounds interesting to you, please hit the subscribe button and check back regularly. Okay, to start to develop some strategies that will answer those questions, let's begin with Daniel and his friends in Daniel chapter 1. I'm not going to read it. I'm going to be teaching it as if you've already read it. So if you haven't read Daniel chapter 1 recently, go ahead and hit the pause button, get your Bible out, read it, and then come back to this video because I'm going to be talking about it as if you've already read it. So go ahead and do that now. Okay, we need to begin with what happened to Daniel to get him to where he is in Daniel chapter 1, basically a polytheistic culture with an aggressive agenda. So here's what happened. In the 6th century BC, King Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem and destroyed Solomon's temple. Why does he do that? Well, basically he needs that strip of land where it's located. That land was sometimes called the Levant. It's French for bridge, I believe. But it was a land bridge, literally, between the great empires of antiquity. And it will act as a buffer zone and a gateway for anyone who controls it. So the great empires of antiquity were always fighting for that strip of land because whoever controlled it controlled access. It was a gateway. Nebuchadnezzar needs that piece of land. He didn't need Jerusalem, but Jerusalem was controlling the land. So he has to control Jerusalem. So he goes in and he destroys Jerusalem, destroys Solomon's temple. And his strategy is to take the brightest, the best that Jerusalem has to offer, take them back to Babylon, assimilate them into the Babylonian culture, and then use their gifts to strengthen Babylon. Now, this strategy is brilliant for a lot of reasons, but there are two things that it accomplishes simultaneously that are super important. The first is that it guts Jerusalem of her brightest and best leaders, which prevents them from fighting back. Everything rises and falls on leadership. And Nebuchadnezzar executes the most prominent of the royal family, and then the rest of them, he deports them from Jerusalem to Babylon, leaving Jerusalem without leadership. Now, the second thing this does is that it benefits Babylon because they can learn from other cultures. This, by the way, sets Babylon apart from other empires of its day, making it one of the most progressive empires. In fact, there is some evidence that 200 years later, Alexander the Great learned from the Babylonians and adapted an improved version of their strategy to Hellenize the entire Mediterranean world. So Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were part of that first group of elite Jerusalemites who were taken to Babylon. They were most likely part of the royal family in Jerusalem, and they would have known each other. Their names indicate that they were royalty. So there are three things that Nebuchadnezzar does right away to force these captives to assimilate into the Babylonian culture. That's the Babylonian goal, is assimilation. That's always the goal of any culture, is to turn you into it, assimilation. So the first thing they do is the most obvious. They isolate them from their cultural roots. They're taken away from Jerusalem. And for them, everything had revolved around Jerusalem. Everything had revolved around the worship at Solomon's temple, the sacrificial system. Their entire faith was built on the sacrificial system and on the temple in Jerusalem. And now that has all been destroyed. It's been taken away from them. And they've been moved far away from their culture. So he removes them from their history, from their culture. He wants to erase their memory banks of their faith so that they will become Babylonians. That's the first thing he does. The second thing they do is they change their names. Names were very, very important in this culture. And the names of Daniel and his friends were associated with their God, with Yahweh. The EL ending or the AH ending to the names were connected to the names of God. El for Elohim and the AH for Yahweh. So when they change their names, they give them corresponding Babylonian names that are associated with the Babylonian gods, Marduk and Ishtar. So Daniel becomes Belteshazzar, Hananiah becomes Shadrach, Mishael becomes Meshach, and Azariah becomes Abednego. They go from names that are associated with Yahweh to names that are associated with the Babylonian gods. You see what they're doing to them? They're trying to assimilate them with their names. And the third thing they do is they indoctrinate them with a crash course on the Babylonian language and culture. It's going to be a 3-year course where they're going to learn everything Babylonian. Now, it says they were going to learn the language and the literature because those were two of the most important and basic building blocks of any culture. They were indoctrinating them into the Babylonian culture and the Babylonian gods. You have to understand that in that day and time, language and literature was intimately and inextricably tied to their religion, to their gods. You could not learn the literature and the language without learning about the gods. So they were studying astronomy, they were studying astrology, they may have been studying the writings of Zoroaster, the founder of Zoroastrianism in Babylon. They were studying the writings of the religious leaders. They were studying the gods of the Babylonians. Now, Daniel is quickly characterized as the leader of this group, and everyone seems to be looking to him. So what does Daniel do? Well, he resolves 3 things for himself. These 3 things are very difficult to do simultaneously. They're hard to do all together, but Daniel resolves himself to do these 3 things. Number 1, he resolves that he will study hard and learn the Babylonian ways even better than his Babylonian oppressors. He is going to learn the culture and learn it well. The second thing he resolves is that he will work hard for the good of Babylon. He will do all he can to keep the peace and to bring prosperity to Babylon. And he's doing this because it's exactly what God told him to do through the prophet Jeremiah. As the exiles were leaving, Jeremiah is hearing from God. He's still in Jerusalem. He doesn't go with them, but he sends a letter. And in that letter, he gives them God's instructions for their life in Babylon. And here's what he says in Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 4-7. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there. Do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. This is the foundation for the strategy that Daniel and his friends are going to use. They understand that if Babylon prospers, they too will prosper. Number 3, and probably the most difficult, Daniel resolves that he will not let the oppressor get inside of him. That's hard to do. This is the place where most people slip and fall. It's hard. Paulo Freire, the great Brazilian philosopher and educator, in his book, A Pedagogy of the Oppressed, talks about this very thing. Freire was working in education with the poorest of the poor in Brazil. And in his work, he revolutionized the way oppressed people are educated. Jane Thompson, writing about Paulo Freire, drawing on his writings, encapsulates the heart or the basis of his educational reforms when she says this: there is no such thing as a neutral education process. Education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate the integration of generations into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity to it, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. That's exactly what Freire was saying. Paulo Freire made a distinction between indoctrination and education, where the latter always teaches you to think critically, even about the educational process that is teaching you to think critically. Freire taught the poor to question everything and to think for themselves. And as part of his pedagogy, he made an observation. His observation was this, that there is a tendency in oppressive cultures for the oppressor to get inside of the oppressed, that the oppressor begins to live inside of the oppressed, that the oppressed are so overwhelmed by the presence and the teachings and the doctrine of the oppressor that the oppressor begins to live inside of them. This is obviously evident when you study certain cases like Cuba, for instance. In the 1950s, there was a revolution against a horrible fascist dictator, Batista, who was terrible. And the people rose from the grassroots revolution. They rose up against Batista. Fidel Castro was a young general in that revolution. And then once they overthrew Batista, the ugly dictator, what did they replace him with? Another ugly dictator. Castro became exactly like Batista, the thing that he was fighting against. Why does that happen over and over again? Because, you see, the oppressor gets inside of the oppressed. And when the oppressed overthrow the oppressor, all they know is what the oppressor has already taught them, and they replicate the same system. There's an example of the opposite of that, South Africa. In South Africa, Nelson Mandela led a great revolution, overthrowing the government. But Nelson Mandela had actually studied the writings of Paulo Freire, and he understood the dangers of letting the oppressor get inside of you, so that when he took over the government, he decided that he was not going to be like the ones who had oppressed him, and he refused to oppress those who had been oppressing him. You understand, this is an important thing that Daniel is trying to do. Daniel is trying to be Nelson Mandela, not Fidel Castro. Daniel has resolved himself that he's not going to allow the oppressor to get inside of him. He's not going to become like them. Now remember, the number one agenda of any culture is to turn you into it. And Daniel says, I'm not letting that happen. So Daniel refuses to let the oppressor get inside of him. He shows a healthy respect for the oppressor. He cooperates with the oppressor. He even works for the good of the oppressor, but he refuses to let the oppressor get inside of him. How does he do that? Well, oddly enough, Daniel decides that he's not going to eat the food and wine that's being offered to him from the king's table. Which, if it was from the king's table, it meant that it was the best food and wine that Babylon could possibly offer. And Daniel refuses to partake of the best food, the food and the wine from the king's table. So why does he do that? Why does Daniel choose to draw the line with food and wine? And more specifically, it was actually meat, the meat and the wine. Why does he draw the line there? The interesting thing about this is that there's absolutely nothing in the Mosaic law that prohibits Daniel from eating meat or wine. Nothing. It's just not there. Now, the Mosaic law had certain restrictions on what kinds of meat he could eat and instructions on how they were to prepare the meat, mainly having to do with blood, so they didn't want animals that had been strangled because of the blood flow and so forth. But that doesn't seem to be the problem for Daniel. If that had been the problem, Daniel could easily have said to the chief administrator, listen, I can only have this kind of meat, but I can't have that kind of meat. Or if I'm going to eat this meat, it has to be prepared this way. But he doesn't do any of that. He says, I'm not eating any of it. Why? Well, the scripture is clear as to why. In Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, it says this, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. It says he decides not to defile himself. And the only possible reason that the meat and the wine would defile him was that it had been used in the sacrificial worship of the Babylonian gods. Meat and wine were commonly used in the Babylonian sacrificial system, just as they were commonly used in the Jewish sacrificial system, same thing. And apparently this meat from the king's table and this wine, all of it had been sacrificed to Babylonian gods before it made it to the king's table. Every piece of meat and every glass of wine at the king's table had been sacrificed to Babylonian gods. And this is where Daniel draws the line. He says, I will not be defiled by eating the wine and the meat, the food, that was a part of the worship of the Babylonian gods. In other words, he was saying, I'll study the Babylonian gods. I'll learn about the Babylonian gods. I'll come to understand the Babylonian gods completely. But here's where I draw the line. I will not worship the Babylonian gods. I absolutely refuse to be a part of anything that is worshiping the Babylonian gods. This is a tricky line to navigate. It's an elusive stance to make. It's not always easy to know when you're supposed to do that. It's not always easy to know when to take this stand. And when you take it, many people are not going to understand why you're taking it. Why this? They must have been asking that about Daniel. Maybe even some of his closest friends were saying, why are you doing this? They won't get it. Like the chief administrator in charge of the indoctrination of Daniel, who basically said, look, I don't understand why you're doing this, and my heart goes out to you, but my neck is on the line about this, not yours. That if this doesn't work out, the king is coming for my head, not yours. Well, that's understandable. So Daniel does two things, and I don't want you to miss this. This is super important. He does two things in response to the culture's attempt to get inside of him. And make no mistake about it, eating from the king's table is the culture trying to get inside of Daniel. Daniel does two things. Number one, Daniel shows respect for the Babylonian culture. He comes to the chief administrator and he negotiates. He negotiates with the culture, which shows respect. I'm telling you, our problem in American Christianity a lot of times is that too often we approach the culture with a great sense of entitlement, that everyone is supposed to bow to us. This sense of entitlement that says, we were here first, there's more of us, we're in charge, we have a history in this country, we've been here a long time. You see, entitled. And we expect everyone else to accommodate to us because we approach the culture with a sense of entitlement. Daniel didn't do that. He showed respect for the culture. He showed respect for those who thought differently than he did. He was ready to negotiate a way that he could serve without letting the culture get inside of him. That shows respect. Number two is that Daniel offers something qualitatively better than what the Babylonians were offering him. Now, don't make the mistake of thinking that the better results that he eventually provided were because of the advantages of the diet he chose. Like being a vegetarian is better than being a meat eater. If you make this about the diet, if you make this about vegetarian versus meat eating, you completely bury the point of Daniel chapter 1. That's not the point of the story. Vegetarianism may or may not be better than meat eating. I don't know, but that's not the point of the story. The point of the story was that it's not about one diet versus another diet. No, the point of the story is that it's about Yahweh, the God of Daniel, versus the God of the Babylonians. It's the rules and the diet of Yahweh versus the rules and the diet of the Babylonians. It's what the worship of Yahweh will do for you versus what the worship of the gods of the Babylonians will do for you. That's the point of the story. It's Yahweh versus the gods of the Babylonians. You see, for Daniel, it wasn't the diet that was at stake. Not at all. It was that Yahweh was going to take care of him. Whatever protein he lost by not eating the meat, Yahweh would provide that protein and compensate for it. It was Yahweh who was victorious over the meat and wine sacrificed to the gods of the Babylonians. That's the point of the story. It was Yahweh who was victorious. Because Daniel was willing to show respect to the Babylonian culture and negotiate, and because he offered something that was obviously qualitatively better. It wasn't the diet. It was the worship of Yahweh. The worship of Yahweh was what was qualitatively better than the worship of the gods of the Babylonians. And as you approach the culture that we live in, unless you are ready to be respectful of that culture, who knows, maybe even learn something from that culture. And unless you're ready to offer something qualitatively better, where your life shows, just like Daniel's life showed, that it was better. Until your life shows that Christianity is better, qualitatively better than all the other options, then this polytheistic culture with an aggressive agenda is never going to listen to you. Okay, so those are the first two strategies. We see very clearly that Daniel was using them. Next week, we're going to look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, and we're going to talk about the strategies they used to confront a polytheistic culture with obviously an aggressive agenda. We're going to talk about exactly what that agenda was. We'll dive a little bit deeper into the agenda itself, and we'll talk about the strategies they used. I hope this is helpful to you. I hope you're enjoying this study, And I pray that God will bless you as you seek to serve him and share him with a culture that so desperately needs him. I pray that God will use you to show a better way than the way of the world. Now, this material has been helpful to you. Please be sure to hit the like button. It gets the video in front of more people and helps out a lot. And be sure to subscribe. And I can't wait to see you next week. God bless you.